Hello, welcome to Goshen Farm. And this is our first virtual open house. So rather than 600 people walking around here today, we just have various speakers and a photographer. And my name is Roy Benner. I'm on the board of directors here, and my actual title is grounds chair. Now, what is a grounds chair? He's the guy that cuts the grass, so that's who you're listening to. We're here at Goshen Farm, and I'll tell you a little bit later, there was never a Mr. and Mrs. Goshen. And everybody asked me, when did they live here? Well, the property owner in the 1700s, he was farming tobacco. So this whole place, not a tree located around here, grew tobacco. And he called it Goshen, probably from a biblical reference to the land of milk and honey. Now, what does that mean? Was there milk and honey flowing out of the ground? No, but we're on the highest piece of property around here, and also very good soils. Okay, this is a Goshen farmhouse. And what you see here is a chimney on the left and a chimney on the right, and it's now covered with stucco. But that house was built in 1783, so that's what, 280 some years old. It's very old anyway, 230 some. Very old house. There was a screened-in porch on the front, and that was enlarged in 1967. And at that point, it was made to, the house dimensions are 33 feet long and about 16 foot wide, and his screen porch was made much larger in 1967. We've closed it in because we've done a lot of work on the house, remediation to get rid of things like asbestos and mold, and the roofs are in very bad shape, and so a lot of water damage. At this point, we're going to go walk around the side, and I can better discuss the houses and when they were built and the architecture. We had a lot of vandalism back in the 2000 period, 2005, and so we put a fence around the place at that time to cut down on the vandalism. Now, here you can get a better view of the various houses, and if you look, the chimney on the right here is another chimney which we saw just a second ago. That's the 1783 house. It was built by a fellow named Gardner, and he was a carpenter. And so he built this house here on the top of the property. But you say that was in 1783, but I didn't tell you, this property goes back to 1663, when Lord Baltimore patented this property as Leonard's Neck. Now, what does this mean? Somebody lived here and farmed, but where was their house? We don't really know. I assume that probably on the same place there was a log structure that when Mr. Gardner came, he took the log structure down and built himself a new, much bigger house. But we just have to guess at that because they didn't keep records. People don't write that they built their log structure today or the log structure burnt down, just like we had a barn back here that burnt down in 1983, but there's only just a quick reference to that. People don't write down, and there was a silo on the barn. And we have pictures of it in the 1942s, and after that there's no picture. Well, you wouldn't spend probably thousands of dollars to build a silo. This is the structure on a farm that holds the silage, and then all of a sudden take it down. Well, I'm a soils person, and I know the soils in that area where the barn was were much clayer, and so I think when he built it, the structure, the foundation wasn't strong enough, and so it probably started leaning. Well, he saw that, so he came in and put a big concrete collar around it to help preserve the structure. However, when you look at that concrete collar that he put around it to help hold it up, that's still cracked, and so he either took the silo down or it fell down. But he didn't write down on Sunday afternoon the silo fell down. So we have to guess at a lot of this stuff from just the remnants that are left. So we have a house here with the chimney on this end and a chimney at that end, built in 1783. When Mr. Gardner died, he passed the property on to his two of his 7 kids. And the son that got this half the property, 147 acres and all the houses, got himself in some financial problems, and the judge in Annapolis made him sell his house and property to pay off the mortgage or the loan that he had borrowed money from. Then the judge in Annapolis has this 147 acres and houses and barns and structures. what did he do? He sells it on the steps of the Capitol, excuse me, of the courthouse. And so he sells this, and a guy named Tydings bought the property. And so he moved here in 1853. This is the time period I'm talking about. Well, that house wasn't big enough for him. And so he looked around. On his property, he had this second house. If you can picture from around, the gutter is on the second floor there to where the electric wires hit the house. That was another house. It's 16 and a half feet, and 16 and a half feet the other way was another house on the property. We kind of think maybe it was south of the property down here. But in 1853, he moved it up and attached it to make his house much bigger. There's some notes in the records that say that this house, when it was located over here, may have been a slave house. We don't know for sure. There's not a lot of records. There were 11 enslaved people on the properties in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And we know many of their names and that stuff in wills. When we're reading wills, it gives breakdowns of all this stuff. What happened is the Board of Education, the Anne Arundel County Board of Education, came to Dr. Radoff. He and his wife May moved here in 1941-42, and they wanted electricity, so they petitioned the BG&E of the time for getting electricity up here. And if you recall, World War II was going on, and all the copper had to go to the war effort. So Dr. Radoff and his wife lived up here for almost 6 years without electricity. Only after the war was over did the BG&E of the time allow them to run copper wire up here, so they got electricity at that point. So that changed how people live and so on. The Board of Education, Anne Arundel County, came to Dr. Radoff and his wife and said, "We want 30 acres of your property." And he says, "Oh, those are my 2 best fields and my orchard." But through the threat of eminent domain, they ended up getting the 30 acres where the Cape St. Clair Elementary School is. Matter of fact, the driveway for the farm used to go out through those athletic fields, and you'll see a row of trees down there. That was the trees beside the driveway. So in 1967, when they started building the elementary school, Dr. Radoff and May had to start using the back driveway here, and that's our only real access to the property at this point. Well, they got enough money from selling that property to the state that they had enough money to build another 2-room addition. On the first floor here on the left, on the bottom, was what she called a piano room. She was an avid piano player, so she had a piano room, and she was also a seamstress sewer. So on the second floor, there's she called it her sewing room. So that was the 3rd addition on this house. Now, as we move on around here, you'll notice that it is stuccoed, and stucco is just basically a cement that you plaster on a house. But that's probably the reason that this house is preserved, because it kept out a lot of the weather and the vermin and those types of things. So it's probably what has saved the house. Even when they put this addition on, they stuccoed it to match the earlier houses here and so on. This last addition, this blank wall here, and on the end of it over here is 2 windows. In 1935, they finally put bathrooms in the house. And on the first floor here, inside here, there's a bathroom right here. And this is where they had their washer and dryer in the bathroom in more modern times here in the 1970s. And then on the second floor was another bathroom. So prior to that, they would go over here behind the hoop house, and that was where their outhouse was. Okay, right behind the hoop house is where the outhouse was. This building here that we're passing is called the Milk House. Over a period of time, there's been 10 to 12 different owners on the property, and various ones, like I said, in the 1700s, they grew tobacco. Then they switched to small grains. There was a small beef cattle operation here for a while, and even a dairy operation. And this is where they would store the milk from the milk cows and so on. Okay, let's move on around. And again, you'll see the same chimney. The houses were very symmetrical back then. And this is the chimney inside. There's some damage to the stucco here, but you'll notice we have lightning rods up there on the top of it. And there's a small window up here. That's the 3rd floor, or what I would call an attic today. This would have been the screened-in porch, but like we said back about 2014, we closed it in when the contractor was taking out the various asbestos and the wet ruin drywall and the mold down. So we're now going to the front of the building, and you can sort of just pretend like this was the screened-in porch that now has plywood on it. Maybe a little dark in here, but this is the porch. When they built the house originally, there was a small porch here, but in 1967, when they got the additional money to put the 2 rooms on the other end of the house, Dr. and Mrs. Radolph built and enlarged the porch to make it the full length of the house. Our house, this original 1783, is 33 feet long and 16 feet from front to back. Very symmetrical. If there's a wind in the front, there was a wind in the back of the house, and we'll notice that better upstairs. We've got a temporary wall here where we store some cleaning supplies and all on the back side here. Now we're entering the 1783 house. Now, the houses at that time, and the archaeologists would describe this house as a 2/2. What does that mean? Well, 2 rooms on the first floor on the right and on the left, and 2 rooms on the second floor with a central hallway and also a stairs. So they would say a 2/2 with a central hallway and stairs. This is what we're looking at. Now, this is the front door that we're standing now, and I'm going to walk back here, and this would have been the back door of the house in 1783, and this would have been the back door. However, as I told you earlier, in 1935, they built a bathroom back here. So this no longer was their back door, this is the entrance to the bathroom. As I said earlier, a lot of water damage here. We had to take up the floor, and the archaeologist at the time, Jane Cox, the County Cultural Division of Planning and Zoning, was very excited with that. We took the floor up. She had the floor down here, the dirt floor, all gridded out, and one of our open houses, she and 4 or 5 other people dug, and they dug out all kinds of artifacts. And matter of fact, when they sieved them through a screen, they got dozens and dozens and dozens of all types of artifacts. Just think about the fact when you go to get in your pocket to unlock your back door, maybe a gold coin will fall out. Well, she didn't find any gold coins, or at least she didn't tell me she did. Anyway, but she found bullets and buttons and beads and belt buckles, all kinds of things that either fell there, or maybe at that time you would want to get rid of something, you just throw out the back door. But that's where the treasure trove was. Another thing is we had a lot of vandals back in the early 2000 period. And you can see up here there were some peg holes. There was for 7 pegs. We have a picture of what it used to look like, where you would hang your coat or your hat. And but when the vandals came in, they broke all these off. Luckily, when we were cleaning up the trash on the floor, we have actually found all 7 pegs, and we have those. And once we start actually restoring the inside, we'll put these pegs back up. The other thing to note here about these walls, and as I step this way, I'm going to put my hand on the back side, and just to show you that the wall is only 1 board thick. Today, when we build a wall, we often use 2x4s, and then we put plywood over it or drywall, so it's a very thick wall. But back then, they just had 1 board thick that went up through the middle. And you have to remember that most all this stuff was done by hand. They hand-hewn the beams, and all the stuff was planed to make the fancy little molding edges. If you look here, you can see it's a beaded edge. Rather than just making a plain board, they made it a beaded board, so it's kind of a fancy thing. As I said, this gentleman was a carpenter. The other thing, while we're pointing in this direction, you notice the height. I'm 6 foot, and very low doors. I'm not really sure I know absolutely why that is, but you hear stories about these houses were heated with fireplaces, Rumford fireplaces. That was a type of fireplace that projected a lot of heat out for that time. And so we have a fireplace on this side and a fireplace on this side. When we go upstairs, we'll see fireplaces also. But anyway, as the fireplace put out heat, this would keep the heat in the room, so it would stay in there rather than going out. This one had a little transom up top that had glass in it, but the kids broke the glass out. So in the summertime, you'd want to get rid of the heat in your house, so you would open this to let the hot air on out. Okay, now let's go in here to the right, and I'm going to call this room the public room, such that when George Washington was walking around, now we don't think he ever came here, but he was in 1783, he was here in Annapolis. That's where he resigned his commission in the State House. in 1783. But if he came to visit the gardeners who built the house, this is the room you brought them to. This was the formal room, so we call it the public room, or they call it the public room. In the 1900s, the people that lived here probably didn't call it the public room. They probably called it the parlor, okay? I'm not real familiar with that term, but I know that in the 1900s they used that term. Today, if this was my house, I'd probably call this the living room, maybe even the family room. So rooms change from public room to parlor to now the living room. Now, why do I say this is the public room? Because if George Washington came, I wouldn't bring him into my bedroom, but I'd bring him into my fancy room. And this is the fancier room. The fireplace here is, if you notice, it's a very fancy mantel with lots of little boards to make it fancy and moldings and so on. Just sort of dressed up the room quite a bit. Now, if we could turn back and look through this way at the far end there, we'll go over there and look in a few minutes. That fireplace mantel is much smaller and very plain compared to this one. So we call this the public room. The other thing to notice about this house, from the outside we call it a stucco house. But again, probably, I'm just sort of guessing at this, probably in the 1900s, maybe the 1920s, they stuccoed the house. That was a very popular thing back in the Victorian period of 1900s. So they put this stucco, which is just plain old cement, on the outside of the house. But that's probably what helped preserve the house and kept it today. We'll see it as we go in another room. There's a lot of termite damage in these houses over the years. But as the roofs were very bad, the contractor had to take out the plastered walls and the lath. We'll see that better upstairs. And so we see the guts of the house. Now I kind of like it because you can see a lot of details here. And if you look over right up here, you can see the house. All these beams are held together with pegs. Can you see that sharpened as stake? A lot of them have been broken off or sawn off over the years, but in different places you'll see other pegs here. Now, one other thing we can look at here is here's just a map of the local area, and this is Cape St. Clair Road down here, and here's the fire department over here. This is the driveway that we came up to come to the property, and this is the house here, and here's another little house that was built in 1926. The people named Bryces that lived here in 1926, and they built that little house right there for him, and he lived in that, and he put several additions on it. There was a barn down here that burnt down in 1983, but if you look, here's the athletic fields. Here's Blue Ridge right here, and here's Hilltop, and the driveway for this house right here used to come out and come right out here to Blue Ridge. It wasn't called Blue Ridge back in the 1700s or 1800s, not until the early 1950s. This became Blue Ridge, but the driveway for this house emptied out here, and those trees were along the driveway. These are the two fields that the county took, and the orchard area for the Cape St. Clair Elementary School, as I said, in 1967. So just a hint of what the property looks like. It's a topo map just showing that this is the highest place. We're about 80, almost 90 feet here where the house is. There's only a few other places in the Cape that are this tall. So the people built their houses here, just like probably the people that owned it in the 1700s built their house here. I doubt they lived in an RV at that time, so probably was a log structure here. And then Mr. Gardner built this house here. Okay, we're going to cross the hallway here. And I'm going to refer to this room. First off, let me explain. You see a new modern 2x4 wall here. Where the cameraman is standing, the floor is actually sunk some, and it's actually sunk about 4.5 inches. Over a period of time, the beams, the floor joists that hold this up, they sat on rocks as an intermediate space, and as the rock slipped out, the beam has settled down, and so it's actually settled maybe 4.5 inches right there. We're trying to decide right now how to handle that, and we're having professional engineers look at it to see whether we should try to jack it back up or just stabilize it in place. So we're making that decision right about now. Meanwhile, when we're upstairs to take some of the bounce out of the floor, we've got these temporary walls here. So this is just a temporary structure that wasn't here. You'll see one of these in each of the rooms here. What I'm going to show you here is, again, the fireplace. If you remember back in the public room, this very large fireplace. And here, the fireplace is about the same size, but the mantle is much smaller. So this wasn't the decorative room. The other thing to notice is down here is the hearth, okay? It's a brick hearth. And if you look upstairs, there's a fireplace up there, and that was the brick hearth, but all the bricks and the mortar were laid on boards. This one board fell down, so we've lost quite a few bricks, and we'll see the damage when we go upstairs. The other thing to talk about when we're talking about this house, again, all the laths are gone. People often ask me, okay, how are you going to restore this thing? And the question I have is, okay, from the outside you say, okay, this is a window that's what, 4 foot tall and 3 foot wide or something like that. But now that we've taken the plaster off and the lath off, we can see that a long time ago, this window that's this big wasn't here. And the reason I can tell you that is this house has structural pieces of members of wood that are about 4 inches by about 6 inches. And you can see that it's been cut. Well, Mr. Gardner, who was a carpenter, wouldn't have cut the structure of his house. But a number of years later, someone was in here and said, wow, this is sure a dark room. We'd like to have a window. And the man said to her, oh, I can fix that for you, honey. And so he cuts a window in there and puts this window in. So we don't know if there was no window here, maybe a smaller window. We know that this window wasn't here when the house was built. And so that's maybe the key takeaway fact at this point. Now I'm going to walk over here on the other side, and you'll notice some kayaks on the floor that I'm walking around. This is one of our fundraisers where we auction off, draw tickets, raffle tickets for the 2 kayaks. Now, we're still in this same room. We call this the dining room, just because the more recent people, the Radoffs, used this as the dining room. We were in the what I would call the living room back there. This is the dining room. And this is just a good place, again, to see all the pegs that hold these timbers together. This is that diagonal piece up there. And all these timbers are very good size, 4 inches by about 6 inches. And again, here's this diagonal here. And again, no nails as we think of the metal nail, but you all can't see the peg back here. But you have to take my word for it. This same timber is up there on the 2nd floor, and there's the peg. And if you look here, again, a lot of the pegs have been broken off and sewn off over the years, but here's another peg. If we turn around here, we can see here's another structural member coming through with a little peg on it. Can you see the peg right there? Again, you see these boards, these things are 14 to 16 inches wide. It's just one board thick as the wall. That's the way they built it, but if you look, it's very decorative. This is a map that just shows the 3rd district. It's like, you know, we talk about counties now, but they had districts. And at this time, this map was 1878, and this red line shows a little house here, and it's called the Tydings house. He was the fellow that moved this other house up and attached it to make a larger house. And you see his name, Henry Tydings. And the other 2 names that maybe you can see here is Alfred and William Stinkham, 2 brothers that had farms further down towards the main beach down there. So they were 2 other farmers that were around at the property, around at that time. This is the 1853 house. We're going to leave that for a minute. We're going to go upstairs and look at the rest of the upstairs. And then when we come back, we'll talk about this house. The one thing to note is here, the ceilings are what? Almost 9 foot tall. And if you watch me over here, the ceilings are, maybe 7 foot, 7.5 feet, something like that. Just keep that fact in mind as we go on upstairs. One other thing is, if we have enough time, there's a side porch over here that had a column that held up the porch. And in going through the trash, this beam used to be that corner column, but it rotted off due to water. And as we were picking it up, I noticed, wow, look at the dates on this thing. And I took a black magic marker and highlighted it. And if you see, somebody a long time ago etched some numbers in here, okay? And it's O, looks like a T and a B, 1917, AGE, age 14. So who in 1914 was 14 years old, or 19, let's say this over, in 1970 was 14 years old, and it was Oliver T. Bryce, probably Tydings, but he just put in the T for the Tydings. They were the owners at that time. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Okay, we're going to go up steps, this central hallway with the steps. And again, you'll see a lot of water damage, so most of the plaster has been taken down. The wood that you see there is called lath. It's wooden strips that are nailed on the wall, and then the plaster is adhered to that. This is the central hallway. When we come upstairs, we find this room, and again, notice the height of these doors, very short. I kind of think this could have been a washroom, but we don't really know. Could have just been a storage room for food, for clothing. Had 6 or 7 children. Maybe this was 2 or 3 of the children slept in there. We don't really know, so it's kind of a guessing point. I'm going to go in this room over here. This again is a second room on the second floor. It's a room here and a room on that side. This room, again, fairly tall ceilings, but not as tall as downstairs. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. This room, the plaster's in pretty good shape. We had a tree that fell in 2014. We just put a new roof on this structure, and all of a sudden we had 4 big silver maple trees on the corner of the house. And we had a storm, and one of the maple tree branches that was 16, 17 inches in diameter fell down and damaged our roof very badly. And one of the small branches broke through here, and that's just the remnants of that damage. But if you notice here, this is the bathroom that we talked about that was added on 1935. And you'll notice you have to step down to go in the bathroom. And you say, well, that's funny. Why would you design a bathroom like that? Well, I won't tell you the story right now, but that was the bathroom addition that was added in 1935. We'll tell you the results of that in a few minutes. So this is pretty good. One thing you'll notice that most of that rooms do not have closets. That's probably because when the tax collector came around, he would tax your property on not only the size of the house, but the number of rooms. So if he's counting rooms, room 1, room 2, room 3, what would be a closet here, that's counted as room 4. So a lot of the old houses didn't have closets because they were taxed additional. This one was added on later on, we don't know when it was, probably a fairly long time ago, but the original room didn't have this closet built into it. And most history know about this room is that May Radoff, Dr. Radoff's wife, this was her bedroom, and she had a fireplace, not as big, and you can see the damage on the hearth there. That's because those boards have fallen out, the bricks have sort of fallen down. So there's quite a bit to repair here, but the plaster's in fairly good shape. Okay, we're going to move across the hall. This is Dr. Radoff's room. He was a state archivist. That's a state employee. He was the one that actually went around to all the counties and gathered up their very important documents. At the time, he was not very well liked because he gathered up all the historical records and the genealogy information, the Civil War records and so on, and put them in the state archives. And only today we realized that, and the counties realized that if he hadn't done that, many of those records have been lost. He talks in his books that he writes that many of the documents were down in the basement of the courthouse, and as we had flooding and so on, they would have been damaged. So he salvaged those things. So all the genealogy records and the Civil War records and so on are in the Hall of Records there on Rowell Boulevard. This is Dr. Radoff's room. And again, it's fairly well preserved. Some places the plaster come off, but in this case, most of the woodwork is in fairly good shape. Again, vandals broke out all the windows, so we have a temporary window there. And we sort of painted on the outside to look like a window, just to keep the larger critters out. The other thing to note about this room, and maybe you all can tell me or what you think. Well, when I find this little place right here, I say, wow, what the heck is this? This little puny place here. This is the outside wall, and here's that structural piece that's in all the corners. And you say, well, I kind of think maybe the gentleman at that time would have kept his rifle in there. But there's actually a board up there, so it's not his rifle. So we don't really know what he kept in there. When we have young kids from the elementary school come over on a tour, I often tell them, I think he kept his gold in there. But you all may know what that little door was for. I thought maybe it had to do with the fireplace. It would let in ventilation for the fireplace, like we open a window to get better draw on the fireplace. But it doesn't seem to do that. The other thing to note is these are the steps that go up to the 3rd floor. I'll call it an attic. And up there, it's wide open from this side to this side, and it's literally 33 feet long. You can sort of have a small soccer game. The only problem is it's only that tall. So it's maybe what, 4.5 feet tall. The other interesting thing is that Mr. Gardner, who built this house, made all these timbers, the roof rafters, down on the ground, and he would put a score on it. So he put Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 1. And when he put them up here, they have a hole drilled in them. He put them here and drive a wooden stake through it, and that's how he marked them. And so we look, they start with Roman numeral 1, about 2 foot away is Roman numeral 2, all the way down. You can see these cut into the wood or with a chisel into them. So he made them on the ground and put them together up in the attic up there. So it's kind of a neat thing. I don't know if you can give the viewers a quick view of that or not. A little bit dark up there, but you can kind of get some idea that it's wide open. And again, you have to remember that these people that lived here, everything they owned had to be in this house. All their clothing, they had to make all their food, all their dishes and everything else. So they need a lot of storage for that stuff. So maybe they stored stuff here, possibly they still live there. We don't really know. The other thing that when an archaeologist, here the plaster was damaged due to a lot of water damage. An archaeologist can look at this structure and not knowing anything about it. If you blindfold them and brought them in and they look at these lath strips, they'd say, this house was built after probably 1750. And why do you say that? Well, you can see there's marks on here where the saw cut these things out. Prior to about 1750, they didn't use saws, weren't very available, sawmills and so on. So they would take a piece of wood and with an axe split out these little pieces of wood and nail them on there. So if an archaeologist looked at this and they were all split out, they'd say, well, this house was probably built prior to 1750. But without knowing anything additional, they can say, this house was built after 1750 because you can tell this. So this is the lath that they put up, and then they put the plaster over it. If you look in here, you can see the plaster on the outside of the house, so the stucco, I should say, that was on the outside of this house. That's how it holds together. Okay, at this point, we're going to go into the 1853 house, and that's another house that Mr. Tydings moved up in 1853. And we said it could have been a slave cabin. And you'll notice I had to step down. Well, why is that? Again, we talked about the ceilings downstairs were maybe, 7 foot tall here and 8 or 9 foot over there. So when you line them up the floors, so you walk from the living room to the kitchen or the dining room to the kitchen, you walk in level. But up here, all of a sudden, when you put them together, this is what's resultant, and you have to step down maybe 10 inches or so. You can see over here in the corner, this would have been the outside of this it's about 12.5 feet wide. This is what we called maybe the slave cabin. A lot of water damage and a lot of termite damage and everything else. But this was the bathroom that they added on the second floor. And again, you see a lot of damage. A large tree branch fell on this roof and broke many of these floor or ceiling joists. And so we had to put new pieces of wood in there. Still a lot of work yet to do to stabilize it. But a lot of serious damage. The other thing to note in this room is they have the same circular stairs as we did back in the 1783 house, but here they're only this big. You couldn't be a heavyset person in those times. And maybe the camera will be able to get a view up there of these very, very narrow steps. And if you look upstairs, you'll see that the same type of little small attic that's up there, again for storage. Maybe people slept there. We don't really know. We just have to kind of guess. Again, a small storage area under the step. From the second floor of this 1853 house, these are the steps that got down to the first floor. We've got them blocked off because right now one step down there has split, and so we have it temporarily blocked off. The last thing you can see here is, I'll try to get in. This is the 1967 edition that's added on, and this is what I described outside as the sewing room. And this is May Radoff's sewing room, and you'll see she was more modern. She had a cedar closet in her room here. So this is what we call the 1967 edition. Now, at this point, if there's any questions, I'll try to keep talking as we go back downstairs, and we'll go in the first floor of this 1853 house. Anybody still awake, I hope?
Yeah, we have 12 people on. No questions that were.
Now we're still in that central hallway. Now we're going back into what we call the dining room now. Now we're going to leave the 1783 house and move into the 1853 house. Now this is probably the last number of people that lived here used this as their kitchen. And in probably and again, I'm guessing, probably around 1950, they redid this. All the floor joists in here are new, modern pieces of wood. And there's a dugout basement under here that I failed to mention about. There's a Bilko door, which is just the old metal doors you lift up and you can go down in the basement. When they finally put heat in these houses, in addition to the fireplaces, they had a coal fire furnace down in the basement. And then they switched from coal to oil. And so when we started cleaning out the house, we ended up taking out 2 large oil tanks that were down there. So only this portion of the house has a basement dugout on it. The rest of the house is a crawl space, so it's only about this big. And that's why we've not been able to get in there to do much repair, because there's not that many skinny people around to try to get in there and repair. Again, modern furring strips on the ceiling, just showing that when they redid this kitchen, they made it very modern. This we call the pantry, and right now we just have some material stored there, but this moved at the same time in the 1853. So when they brought this house up here, they brought this little addition on here we call a pantry, just because that's what they've used it for in the last, 60, 80 years. Again, we sold the steps that came down. These would have been the steps that went down into the basement. Originally it was just a closet, but then they built steps there that went down to the basement, but there's a lot of water damage and the steps have sort of rotted away in most cases. So that's how they would have gotten to the basement. The literature we see of the Radolphs, May Radolph didn't like going down there because it was damp and wet and so on. This is the 1967 edition. This is where we store a lot of our stuff. But probably the best thing that we can show you here is if we look at this wall, we can show you that this was the exterior wall of the 1853 house. It was a wooden house. You can see the various boards nailed here. But like I said, probably in the 1900s period, they nailed a metal lath on there, which is like a chicken wire, and then they put this concrete stuff over top of it, and we call it stucco. So this is just where you can see that, yes, they were wooden houses, but only in the later life were they stuccoed. I don't know if you all have any questions. We enjoyed having you here for your virtual tour. And if you have any questions, please give a call. I'm Roy Benner. I'm one of the grounds chair. You can come visit the property most times. We have a gate that's closed, that closes off our driveway. But there's a lot of gardeners here that are members of Goshen Farm. So if they're here and you see the gates open, you're welcome to come up and look around. We'd like you to be members to help pay for the gasoline that takes to cut the grass and the insurance that we need to have and so on. So thank you very much for coming to our first annual virtual open house tour. Thank you very much. Have a good day.